It was another late evening at the gleaming headquarters of Tech Solutions International. The sun had already set, casting long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the CEO's office on the top floor. Mr. Chen, the company's founder and CEO, sat at his desk, his suit jacket draped over his chair, sleeves rolled up as he scrolled through the latest employee satisfaction survey results on his tablet. Something wasn't adding up. On paper, everything looked perfect. Competitive salaries, great benefits, modern offices with all the perks young professionals dreamed of. But there was this nagging feeling he couldn't shake off. The responses felt rehearsed, too perfect. Like everyone was saying exactly what they thought management wanted to hear. He took off his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes, thinking back to what happened earlier that day. He'd walked past the break room and heard laughter and animated conversation, but the moment he stepped in to grab a coffee, everything changed. The natural chatter died instantly. Everyone sat up straighter, pulled out their phones, or suddenly remembered urgent work at their desks. The transformation was so obvious it was almost funny, almost if it hadn't been so concerning. "Good afternoon, sir," they'd said, voices polite but distant. He'd seen genuine smiles turn into professional masks in seconds. It wasn't the respect that bothered him. It was the wall that came up, blocking any chance of real connection or honest feedback. Later that day, during a company-wide presentation, he'd noticed something else. The questions from employees were all safe, carefully worded. Nobody challenged anything, nobody raised real concerns. It was like watching a perfectly scripted play where everyone knew their lines, but nobody was being real. Mr. Chen spun his chair around to face the city skyline, the lights twinkling like stars against the darkening sky. He thought about his journey, growing up in a small apartment above his parents' grocery store, working his way through college, starting this company from scratch. He'd promised himself he'd never lose touch with his roots, never forget what it was like to be the person at the bottom looking up. But somehow, without him noticing, a gap had grown between him and his employees. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his recent photos, stopping at one taken at last month's company picnic. Hundreds of smiling faces looked back at him, but he couldn't help wondering how many of those smiles were genuine and how many were just for the camera. The cleaning staff was starting their evening rounds. He could hear the distant hum of the vacuum cleaner. Mr. Chen watched as one of the cleaners, an elderly man, appeared in the corridor outside his office. The moment the cleaner noticed him through the glass walls, his whole demeanor changed. He quickly looked down and hurried past, as if trying to make himself invisible. That was the moment something clicked in Mr. Chen's mind. He'd been looking at this all wrong. Surveys, feedback forms, suggestion boxes, they were all just tools that created more distance. If he really wanted to know what was happening in his company, he needed to experience it from the other side. He opened his laptop and started typing a message to his old friend from college, now a successful business consultant. "Need your advice on something unconventional," he wrote, then paused. What he was considering was either brilliant or completely crazy, maybe both. His friend's response came quickly. "Still up? Must be important." Mr. Chen smiled and began typing again. "What if I told you I'm thinking about becoming someone else for a while?" As he explained his idea, his excitement grew. He wasn't just going to pretend to be another employee, that wouldn't be enough. He needed to become someone people wouldn't expect to be watching, someone they might even underestimate, someone who could observe without being observed. The pieces started falling into place in his mind. He'd need help, of course, medical professionals, acting coaches, experts in disability awareness. This wasn't something to be taken lightly. But for the first time in months, he felt energized, purposeful. His phone buzzed with another message from his friend. "You're either a genius or you've finally lost it. Either way, I'm in." Mr. Chen looked around his spacious office, the awards on the walls, the expensive furniture, all the trappings of success. Soon he'd be seeing it all from a completely different perspective. The thought was both terrifying and thrilling. He started making notes, his mind racing with possibilities. This wasn't just about uncovering problems, it was about understanding his company's soul, its true culture. What did people say when they thought nobody important was listening? How did they treat those they thought couldn't see or hear them? As he wrote, the night deepened outside his window, but Mr. Chen barely noticed. He was too busy planning how to become invisible in his own company. Tomorrow, he'd start making the necessary arrangements. But tonight, he allowed himself to simply imagine the possibilities. The cleaning staff had finished their rounds, and the office was quiet now. Mr. Chen gathered his things, ready to head home. As he waited for the elevator, he studied his reflection in the polished doors. Soon, the face looking back at him would be unrecognizable, not just in appearance, but in how the world perceived and treated him. The elevator arrived with a soft ding. As he stepped in, he smiled to himself. His employees thought they knew their CEO, but they were about to meet someone entirely different. Someone who might just change everything about how their company worked. Little did they know, their lives were all about to become part of an extraordinary experiment in understanding, empathy, and transformation. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Dr. Li's private office as Mr. Chen sat across from his old college friend, now a respected business consultant. They hadn't met in person for months, but today's conversation couldn't happen over the phone. "Let me get this straight," Dr. Li said, leaning forward in his leather chair. "You want to pretend to be blind and deaf to understand your company better." He wasn't judging, there was genuine curiosity in his voice. Mr. Chen nodded, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. "I know it sounds crazy." "Actually," Dr. Li interrupted, "it might be brilliant, but we need to do this right." He pulled out a notepad and started writing. "This isn't just about putting on an act. We need to make sure we're respectful to the communities we're learning from." Over the next few hours, they sketched out a plan. Mr. Chen would become Mr. Wong, a new customer service representative. They chose the name carefully, common enough to be forgettable, different enough from Chen to avoid suspicion. "First things first," Dr. Li said, "we need to talk to people who actually live with these disabilities. We need to understand their experiences, their challenges, their daily reality." The next week was a whirlwind of meetings. They consulted with disability rights advocates, medical professionals, and specialists in workplace accommodation. Each conversation opened Mr. Chen's eyes to perspectives he'd never considered before. A blind consultant named Mr. Park spent 3 days teaching him the basics of using a white cane. "It's not just about moving around," he explained, tapping the cane rhythmically against the floor. "It's about confidence, about trust in yourself and your tools." The training was harder than Mr. Chen expected. Simple tasks like finding a door or navigating a crowded space suddenly became complex challenges. More than once, he found himself completely disoriented in familiar places. "Good," Mr. Park said when Chen expressed his frustration. "Remember this feeling. Remember what it's like to need help but be afraid to ask for it." The sign language training was equally intense. Mrs. Wu, a deaf educator, worked with him for hours each day. "Communication is more than just signs," she explained through an interpreter. "It's about expression, about being present in a world that often forgets to include you." Between training sessions, Mr. Chen worked with a makeup artist who specialized in theater productions. She showed him how to alter his appearance subtly but effectively, changes that would hold up under daily scrutiny. "The key is consistency," she explained, demonstrating how to apply the makeup that would slightly change the shape of his nose and jaw. People noticed patterns more than details. They'd also brought in Mr. Zhang, a behavioral consultant, to help Mr. Chen develop his new persona. "Your biggest challenge won't be acting disabled," he explained. "It will be unlearning your habits as CEO. You've spent years projecting authority, now you need to learn how to become invisible." They'd practiced in various settings: restaurants, shopping malls, public transport. Mr. Chen learned firsthand how the world treated someone with disabilities. Some people were incredibly kind, others awkwardly avoided interaction, and a few acted as if he didn't exist at all. One afternoon, while practicing in a busy coffee shop, an elderly woman spent 10 minutes helping him order and find a seat. Her kindness nearly brought tears to his eyes. Later that same day, he heard 2 teenagers mocking his attempts to communicate with signs. The contrast was eye-opening. Back in Dr. Li's office, they finalized the details of Mr. Wong's backstory. He would be a recent hire, transferred from a smaller city, with experience in customer service. They arranged for an interpreter, actually a trusted former colleague who knew the truth, to assist with workplace communication. "What about your board?" Dr. Li asked during one of their planning sessions. "They need to know something." Mr. Chen had thought about this. I've told them I'm taking a sabbatical to work on special projects. They think I'm investigating potential new markets. As the day of the transformation approached, Mr. Chen felt a mix of excitement and fear. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror, practicing the subtle changes in expression and posture that Mr. Zhang had taught him. Remember, Dr. Li had said in their final preparation meeting, this isn't about tricking people, it's about understanding them. About seeing your company through different eyes. The night before his first day as Mr. Wong, Mr. Chen couldn't sleep. He stood at his apartment window, looking out at the city lights. Tomorrow, he would walk into the building he owned as a completely different person. His own employees would pass him in the hallways without a second glance. He touched the white cane leaning against his wall, his constant companion for the next few months. The specialized glasses that would help maintain his cover lay ready on his bedside table, along with the hearing aids that were actually sophisticated recording devices. Everything was ready. His temporary apartment across town was set up. His new wardrobe, carefully chosen to be completely different from his usual style, was packed. All the paperwork was in place. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Mr. Chen realized that tomorrow wasn't just about fooling others. It was about discovering truths about his company, about people, and maybe most importantly, about himself. The morning of his transformation arrived with the first rays of sunlight peeking through unfamiliar curtains. Mr. Chen woke up in his temporary apartment, 20 miles from his usual luxury condo. Everything felt different. The cheaper mattress, the smaller space, the sound of buses passing on the street below. He took his time getting ready, following the routine he'd practiced for weeks. The clothes came first, simple khakis and a light blue button-down shirt from a department store, nothing like his usual tailored suits. Then the makeup, applied carefully with techniques the theater artist had taught him. He'd practiced this so many times he could do it with his eyes closed. The face that looked back at him from the mirror was subtly different. Not a dramatic change, but enough that his own employees might pass him in the hallway without a second glance. The specialized glasses completed the transformation. Thick-framed and slightly tinted, they helped sell the illusion of visual impairment while containing tiny cameras that would record his experiences. His phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Li. Ready? Mr. Chen took a deep breath and replied, "As I'll ever be." The commute to work was his first real test. Instead of his usual private car, he took the bus. Standing at the bus stop with his white cane, he experienced something new, the feeling of being simultaneously visible and invisible. Some people stared openly, others deliberately looked away. A young boy pointed at him until his mother quietly scolded him. When the bus arrived, the driver was surprisingly kind, announcing the stop clearly and helping him find a seat. An elderly woman offered him her spot near the front, and though he tried to decline, she insisted. These small acts of kindness touched him deeply, even as he felt guilty about his deception. Arriving at his own building felt surreal. He'd walked through these doors thousands of times, but never like this. The security guard he'd known for years looked right through him, just glancing at his new employee badge before waving him through. Mr. Lai, his interpreter, actually a trusted former employee who was in on the plan, met him in the lobby. They'd rehearsed their interaction countless times, the formal introduction, the careful way Mr. Lai would interpret both sign language and speech, making their communication seem natural to observers. The HR orientation was both fascinating and nerve-wracking. Ms. Patel, the HR director who had no idea she was addressing her CEO, was professionally cordial. She explained company policies carefully, speaking directly to him rather than just to his interpreter, something he learned was unfortunately rare. "We've arranged for your workstation to have all the necessary accommodations," she explained, leading them to a desk in the customer service department. "If you need anything else, please don't hesitate to ask." The equipment was exactly what any visually and hearing impaired employee would need: special software, modified keyboard, adjusted monitor settings. Mr. Chen had approved these purchases himself months ago, but seeing them in use gave him a new perspective on workplace accessibility. His new coworkers reacted to him in various ways. Some were openly friendly, others awkwardly distant. A few spoke loudly and slowly to him, despite Mr. Lai explaining that he could read lips and communicate through sign language. One colleague, Mr. Zhao, immediately offered to show him where the break room was and asked if he'd like to join their lunch group. Throughout the day, Mr. Chen caught snippets of conversation about the new guy. Most were kind, some were curious, a few were unfortunately ignorant. He noted everything, experiencing firsthand how people behave when they think someone can't hear or see them. The work itself was humbling. Tasks he could usually complete in minutes now took much longer as he adjusted to his new tools and limitations. His fingers fumbled with the special keyboard, and he had to constantly remind himself to maintain his role, to not automatically respond to sounds or movement in ways that would break his cover. By late afternoon, he was exhausted. It wasn't just the physical strain of maintaining his disguise, it was the emotional toll of being treated so differently. Simple things like finding the bathroom or getting coffee became complicated missions requiring help from others. On the bus ride home, he reflected on everything he'd observed. The kindness of some people had been touching, the unconscious bias of others enlightening. He'd learned more about his company's actual operations in one day than in months of reading reports. Back in his temporary apartment, he carefully removed his disguise. His neck ached from maintaining an unfamiliar posture, and his eyes were tired from the specialized glasses. But as he looked in the mirror at his regular self again, he knew this experience was already changing him. He opened his laptop to make notes about the day, documenting everything while it was fresh in his mind. The real test would come in the days ahead. Building relationships, gathering genuine feedback, understanding the true culture of his company from a completely different perspective. As he prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with another text from Dr. Lee. How did it go? Mr. Chen thought for a moment before replying. I'm not the same person who walked into that building this morning. He set his alarm for the next day, laying out his clothes and supplies for another day as Mr. Wong. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new insights, and hopefully, more understanding of both his company and himself. 2 weeks into his new role as Mr. Wong, the daily routines were becoming more natural. The morning bus ride, the careful way he used his white cane, the practiced movements of sign language, all of it was starting to feel less like an act and more like a genuine part of his life. But it was the things he was learning about his company that truly opened his eyes. That morning, he sat at his workstation, processing customer service tickets through his specially adapted computer system. His interpreter, Mr. Lai, sat nearby, helping him communicate with colleagues when needed. What fascinated him most wasn't the work itself, it was the conversations happening around him, the ones people had when they thought nobody important was listening. They cut the break room budget again, he overheard one colleague whisper to another. But I bet the executive floor still gets their fancy coffee machine. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd approved that budget cut himself, thinking it was a minor efficiency measure. Now he understood how these small decisions affected employee morale. During lunch, Mr. Zhao, the friendly coworker from his first day, invited him to join a group in the break room. Through Mr. Lee's interpretation, he learned about the real challenges his frontline employees faced. They talked about outdated software that slowed down their work, about managers who took credit for their ideas, about the struggle to balance customer satisfaction metrics with actual customer needs. You know what's funny, Mr. Wong? One colleague said during their lunch break, sometimes I think the big bosses have no idea what actually happens down here. They sit in their offices upstairs, looking at charts and numbers, but they don't see how hard we work. The conversation shifted to salary discussions, something they'd never have in front of management. He learned about a talented customer service representative who was supporting 3 kids on her salary, another who worked a second job to make ends meet, and a team leader who hadn't received a promotion in 5 years despite excellent performance. Later that afternoon, he witnessed something that made his heart sink. A young employee presented an innovative solution for improving customer response times during a team meeting. The supervisor nodded along, took notes, and then later, in a management meeting that was happening near Mr. Wong's desk, presented the same idea as his own. The original employee sat just a few cubicles away, unaware that her idea was being stolen. But it wasn't all negative. He also saw countless acts of kindness and dedication. There was the tech support guy who stayed late every Thursday to help elderly customers who struggled with the company's website. The team leader who used her own lunch break to mentor new employees. The colleagues who learned basic sign language just to make him feel more welcome. One particularly memorable moment came when the office printer broke down. As Mr. Won, he stood there feeling helpless, his white cane in one hand and papers in the other. Without hesitation, 3 different people offered to help, working together to solve the problem. It showed him how people could unite and support each other when given the chance. Through Mr. Lee's interpretations, he also learned about the informal networks that kept the company running, the unwritten rules, the unofficial problem solvers, the real communication channels that existed parallel to the official ones. It was like discovering a whole new company within his company. Some revelations were painful. He overheard comments about diversity initiatives being just for show, about how certain departments were known for favoring specific groups, about how some managers were experts at looking good on paper while treating their teams poorly. But he also discovered heroes he never knew existed. Like Ms. Wong, no relation, a senior customer service representative who quietly mentored younger employees, helping them navigate office politics and develop their careers. Or Mr. Kumar, who had developed unofficial shortcuts and tools that made everyone's work easier but had never received recognition for it. One day, he had a particularly challenging interaction with a frustrated customer. As he struggled to handle the situation, he watched how his colleagues supported each other, stepping in to help without being asked. It was a side of his company he'd never seen from his executive office, the real teamwork that happened at the ground level. During team meetings, he observed how information flowed, or didn't flow, up the management chain. Good ideas often got stuck at middle management, while questionable decisions from above were implemented without any feedback from those actually doing the work. The most enlightening moments often came during casual conversations. People spoke freely around him, perhaps because they assumed his disabilities meant he couldn't fully understand or report what was happening. They discussed their hopes, their frustrations, their ideas for making things better, all the things they'd never say in an official survey or meeting. By the end of the month, he had filled dozens of pages with notes about what needed to change. Some were big systemic issues that would require major policy changes. Others were simple fixes that could make a huge difference in people's daily work lives. But beyond the practical insights, he was changing as a person. Every morning, as he put on his disguise, he felt less like a CEO playing a role and more like someone who was truly part of the team. He found himself caring deeply about his co-workers' lives, their struggles, their successes. One evening, as he rode the bus home, he realized something profound. The company he thought he knew so well was actually 2 different worlds, the one he saw from his executive office and the real one he was experiencing now. Bridging that gap would be his biggest challenge yet. 3 months into his role as Mr. Wong, the crisis began with a simple spreadsheet. While processing customer feedback reports, he noticed something odd about the numbers. Through his specially adapted computer system, he could see patterns that didn't quite add up. Customer satisfaction scores that jumped impossibly high in certain regions. That morning had started like any other. He'd taken his usual bus ride, navigated the familiar path to his desk with his white cane, and settled into his daily routine. Mr. Lai, his interpreter, was helping him communicate with a colleague about a customer issue when he first spotted the discrepancy. "These numbers look strange," he signed to Mr. Lai, careful to keep his movements subtle. Around him, the office buzzed with the usual morning activity. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, coffee cups clinking. But something felt off. During the team's morning meeting, Mr. Tang, the regional manager, presented the latest performance metrics. Through his specialized glasses, Mr. Chen watched as the manager confidently displayed graphs showing remarkable improvement in customer satisfaction scores. "Our region has shown a 40% increase in positive feedback," Mr. Tang announced proudly. "This puts us well ahead of all other branches." But Mr. Chen had seen the raw data. He knew these numbers weren't just improved, they were impossible. As Mr. Wong, he sat quietly, his white cane leaning against his chair, while his mind raced with the implications of what he was witnessing. Later that day, he overheard a conversation between 2 team leaders near the water cooler. They thought he couldn't hear them. People often forgot that being visually impaired didn't automatically mean complete hearing loss. "I don't know how Tang does it," one whispered. "Every month, like magic, the numbers look perfect." "Better not ask too many questions," the other replied. "Remember what happened to Ms. Park when she started digging into last quarter's reports." That comment sent a chill down his spine. Through careful investigation over the next few days, he learned that Ms. Park, a former team leader, had been transferred to a different department after raising concerns about the accuracy of certain reports. The situation became more complicated when he discovered how deep the deception went. Mr. Tang wasn't just fudging numbers, he had created an elaborate system of fake customer feedback entries. Worse, he was using junior employees to do the dirty work, often pressuring them with threats about job security. One young employee, Mr. Xu, was particularly struggling with the situation. During lunch break, Mr. Chen observed him sitting alone, barely touching his food, obviously stressed. Through Mr. Li's interpretation, he struck up a conversation. Sometimes, Mr. Xu confided, not knowing he was speaking to the CEO, "I wish I could tell someone what's really happening here. But who would listen to someone like me?" The irony of his position hit Mr. Chen hard. As Mr. Wang, he was powerless to help directly. As CEO, he could stop this immediately, but doing so would reveal his identity and potentially compromise the larger truths he was uncovering about his company. The crisis deepened when he discovered that Mr. Tang's methods weren't just unethical, they were creating real problems for customers. Real complaints were being buried, serious issues were being marked as resolved without actually being addressed, and employees were being forced to participate in the cover-up. During a department meeting, Mr. Chen watched as Mr. Tang berated an employee for taking too long with customer calls. "Quality doesn't matter as much as quantity," he said. "Just get the numbers up." The same manager then turned to Mr. Wang with barely concealed disdain, making a comment about how some people were probably reducing team efficiency. The discrimination he faced as Mr. Wang became more obvious too. Mr. Tang would often speak about him as if he wasn't there, making assumptions about his capabilities. "Are we sure he can handle these reports?" He'd ask Mr. Lai, standing right in front of Mr. Wang. "Maybe we should give him simpler tasks." 3 months into his role as Mr. Wang, the crisis began with a simple spreadsheet. While processing customer feedback reports, he noticed something odd about the numbers. Through his specially adapted computer system, he could see patterns that didn't quite add up. Customer satisfaction scores that jumped impossibly high in certain regions. That morning had started like any other. He'd taken his usual bus ride, navigated the familiar path to his desk with his white cane, and settled into his daily routine. Mr. Lai, his interpreter, was helping him communicate with a colleague about a customer issue when he first spotted the discrepancy. "These numbers look strange," he signed to Mr. Lai, careful to keep his movements subtle. Around him, the office buzzed with the usual morning activity. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, coffee cups clinking. But something felt off. During the team's morning meeting, Mr. Tang, the regional manager, presented the latest performance metrics. Through his specialized glasses, Mr. Chen watched as the manager confidently displayed graphs showing remarkable improvement in customer satisfaction scores. "Our region has shown a 40% increase in positive feedback," Mr. Tang announced proudly. "This puts us well ahead of all other branches." But Mr. Chen had seen the raw data. He knew these numbers weren't just improved, they were impossible. As Mr. Wang, he sat quietly, his white cane leaning against his chair, while his mind raced with the implications of what he was witnessing. Later that day, he overheard a conversation between 2 team leaders near the water cooler. They thought he couldn't hear them. People often forgot that being visually impaired didn't automatically mean complete hearing loss. "I don't know how Tang does it," one whispered. "Every month, like magic, the numbers look perfect." "Better not ask too many questions," the other replied. "Remember what happened to Ms. Park when she started digging into last quarter's reports?" That comment sent a chill down his spine. Through careful investigation over the next few days, he learned that Ms. Park, a former team leader, had been transferred to a different department after raising concerns about the accuracy of certain reports. The situation became more complicated when he discovered how deep the deception went. Mr. Tang wasn't just fudging numbers, he had created an elaborate system of fake customer feedback entries. Worse, he was using junior employees to do the dirty work, often pressuring them with threats about job security. One young employee, Mr. Xu, was particularly struggling with the situation. During lunch break, Mr. Chen observed him sitting alone, barely touching his food, obviously stressed. Through Mr. Lee's interpretation, he struck up a conversation. Sometimes, Mr. Xu confided, not knowing he was speaking to the CEO, "I wish I could tell someone what's really happening here. But who would listen to someone like me?" The irony of his position hit Mr. Chen hard. As Mr. Wang, he was powerless to help directly. As CEO, he could stop this immediately, but doing so would reveal his identity and potentially compromise the larger truths he was uncovering about his company. The crisis deepened when he discovered that Mr. Tang's methods weren't just unethical, they were creating real problems for customers. Real complaints were being buried, serious issues were being marked as resolved without actually being addressed, and employees were being forced to participate in the cover-up. During a department meeting, Mr. Chen watched as Mr. Tang berated an employee for taking too long with customer calls. "Quality doesn't matter as much as quantity," he said. "Just get the numbers up." The same manager then turned to Mr. Wang with barely concealed disdain, making a comment about how some people were probably reducing team efficiency. The discrimination he faced as Mr. Wang became more obvious too. Mr. Tang would often speak about him as if he wasn't there, making assumptions about his capabilities. "Are we sure he can handle these reports?" He'd ask Mr. Lai, standing right in front of Mr. Wang. "Maybe we should give him simpler tasks." But the real eye-opener came during a crisis with a major client. A team of junior employees had actually solved the problem with an innovative approach, working late into the night. The next morning, Mr. Tang presented their solution to upper management as his own idea, never mentioning the team that had actually done the work. The young employees sat at their desks, watching their hard work being credited to someone else. One of them, Ms. Liu, had tears in her eyes as she pretended to be focused on her computer screen. That evening, as Mr. Chen removed his disguise in his temporary apartment, he faced a moral dilemma. He had enough evidence to stop Mr. Tang's fraudulent activities, but exposing him now might prevent him from understanding how deep these problems went in other parts of the company. His phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Lei, "Monthly report meeting tomorrow. Still want to keep going?" Mr. Chen looked at himself in the mirror. The man he'd become over these months, the things he'd learned, the people he'd met. He thought about Mr. Xu's stress, Ms. Liu's tears, and all the other employees suffering under poor leadership. "One more week," he texted back. "There's something bigger happening here. We need to understand the whole system." As he prepared for bed, he could hear police sirens in the distance. Tomorrow, he would put his disguise back on and return to being Mr. Wang. But soon, very soon, it would be time to reveal the truth and make things right. The day of revelation arrived with a company-wide meeting scheduled in the main conference hall. 4 months of living as Mr. Wang had led to this moment. Mr. Chen arrived early that morning, still in his disguise, sitting quietly in his usual spot in the customer service department. His colleagues were buzzing with excitement about the meeting. The rumor mill was working overtime. People whispered about possible layoffs, company sales, or major restructuring. Nobody could have guessed the real reason they were being called together. "Maybe they're finally going to address the budget cuts," Mr. Zhao said, adjusting his tie nervously. "I heard the CEO is back from his special project," another colleague mentioned. "Must be big news." Mr. Chen watched them through his specialized glasses, knowing these would be the last moments he'd spend as Mr. Wang. His heart was racing, but his hands were steady as he gripped his white cane. At 10 a.m., everyone filed into the conference hall. Mr. Chen sat in his usual spot near the back, Mr. Li beside him as always. Mr. Tang, the regional manager he'd caught falsifying reports, strode in confidently, probably expecting another chance to show off his fraudulent success metrics. The room fell silent as Dr. Li stepped onto the stage. "Good morning, everyone. Today's meeting is different from any we've had before. Our CEO has something important to share with you." The crowd murmured, expecting Mr. Chen to walk in from the main entrance. Instead, Dr. Li gestured toward the back of the room. "Mr. Wang, would you please join me on stage?" The confusion was immediate. People turned to stare at Mr. Wang, the quiet customer service representative with visual and hearing impairments. Mr. Chen stood up slowly, left his white cane leaning against the chair, and walked confidently toward the stage without any assistance. As he climbed the steps, he removed his specialized glasses. The makeup that had subtly altered his features for months had been removed that morning. Standing center stage, he looked out at his employees, really looked at them for the first time without any disguise. "Many of you know me as Mr. Wong," he began, his voice clear and strong. "But I'm actually your CEO, Mr. Chen." The gasps were audible. Mr. Tang's face went pale. In the audience, Mr. Zhao's mouth hung open in shock. Ms. Liu, whose idea had been stolen by Mr. Tang, gripped her chair so hard her knuckles turned white. "For the past 4 months, I've worked alongside you as a customer service representative. I've experienced our company not as a CEO, but as someone you thought couldn't see or hear you properly. What I learned has changed me forever." He went on to share his experiences, the kindness he'd witnessed, the challenges he'd discovered, the systemic problems he'd uncovered. He talked about the real heroes of the company, the ones who showed up every day and gave their all despite the obstacles they faced. "Mr. Zhao," he said, looking at his friend from customer service, "your daily kindness to someone you thought was disabled showed me what real leadership looks like. Ms. Liu, your innovative solution to the Henderson account crisis was brilliant. And yes, I know it was your idea, not Mr. Tang's." The reactions in the room were a mix of emotions. Some people looked betrayed, others relieved. Mr. Tang tried to slip out quietly but found security personnel politely blocking his exit. "I know some of you feel deceived," Mr. Chen continued. "You have every right to those feelings. But everything I learned, every conversation we had, every moment we shared, it was all real. The only fake thing was my disability, and I apologize to the disability community for using their experience to learn these lessons." He projected some slides showing the real company statistics, including Mr. Tang's falsified reports alongside the actual numbers. "We're going to fix this," he promised. "Not with fake numbers or quick fixes, but with real, meaningful changes." Mr. Lai stood up next, revealing his own role in the operation. As he explained his part, people began to understand the scope of what had happened. This wasn't just a CEO's whim, it was a carefully planned mission to understand the true heart of the company. The questions started flowing. Some were angry. "How could you spy on us like this?" Others were hopeful. "Will you really fix the problems you saw?" Many were simply curious about how he had maintained the deception for so long. Mr. Chen answered each question honestly, acknowledging both the ethical complications of his actions and the valuable insights they had provided. He announced immediate changes, Mr. Tang's removal, promotions for employees like Ms. Liu whose talents had been suppressed, and a complete overhaul of the reporting system. "But the biggest change," he said, "is in how we communicate. From now on, every employee will have a direct line to senior management. No more stolen ideas, no more buried complaints, no more fear of speaking up." As the meeting continued, something remarkable happened. People began to share their own stories, problems they'd noticed, solutions they'd developed, challenges they'd faced. The wall between management and employees began to crack. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had transformed from shock to cautious optimism. Mr. Chen invited everyone to one-on-one meetings over the next few weeks to share their thoughts and concerns privately. As people filed out of the conference hall, he overheard snippets of conversation that gave him hope. "Can't believe I taught the CEO how to use the copy machine. Remember when we shared our lunch with him that day? At least now we know someone up there understands what we deal with." The revelation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Mr. Chen knew that rebuilding trust would take time, but he was ready for the challenge. After all, he wasn't just their CEO anymore. He was someone who had walked in their shoes, seen through their eyes, and understood their daily reality. 1 year had passed since the day Mr. Chen revealed his true identity to his employees. The company's headquarters looked different now, not just in its physical appearance, but in its entire atmosphere. The old divisions between floors had literally been torn down, replaced with open spaces where employees from all levels could work together. On this particular morning, Mr. Chen sat in the new community workspace, sharing coffee with a group of customer service representatives. No special table was reserved for him, no executive privileges separated him from his team. He was just another person in the conversation. "Remember when you spilled coffee all over yourself as Mr. Wong?" Mr. Zhao laughed, now comfortable enough to joke about those days. "We all rushed to help, thinking you couldn't see where the napkins were." Mr. Chen smiled, remembering that moment. The kindness you showed me that day, that's what we've built our new company culture on. The changes they'd implemented over the past year were significant. The old hierarchy had been rebuilt from the ground up. Every department now had a representative on the executive board, ensuring that frontline workers' voices were heard in every major decision. The former customer service area, where Mr. Chen had spent his months as Mr. Wong, had been transformed into an innovation hub. Ideas could come from anyone, anywhere in the company. Ms. Liu, whose solution had once been stolen by Mr. Tang, now led her own team, developing new ways to improve customer experience. Last week, one of our junior employees spotted a flaw in our new software, Ms. Liu shared during a team meeting. Instead of being afraid to speak up, she came directly to me. We fixed it before it became a problem. That's the difference now. The company had also established a comprehensive disability support program inspired by Mr. Chen's experience. Real accommodations were put in place, designed with input from actually disabled employees and disability rights advocates. They'd hired several employees with various disabilities, providing them with genuine opportunities rather than token positions. "We learned so much from your experience," said Mr. Lai, who had stayed with the company as head of inclusive workplace initiatives. But the real learning came from listening to our actually disabled colleagues about their daily experiences. The changes weren't just internal. Customer satisfaction scores, real ones this time, had reached all-time highs. Employees were genuinely engaged with their work, knowing their ideas would be heard and their contributions recognized. One morning, Mr. Chen found a letter on his desk from a new employee. "When I started here," it read, "I heard about how our CEO once worked in customer service to understand our challenges. It made me feel like this was a place where everyone's work matters." The story of his undercover journey had spread beyond the company, inspiring other business leaders to reconsider how they connected with their employees. But Mr. Chen knew it wasn't about the grand gesture, it was about the daily commitment to maintaining that connection. Regular walk-in-their-shoes days were now company policy. Every executive spent one day each month working in different departments, not as observers but as active participants. They answered customer calls, worked with the maintenance team, joined the IT department in solving problems. The old break room, once slated for budget cuts, had been transformed into a community space where employees from all levels met and shared ideas. The fancy coffee machine from the executive floor had been moved there, symbolic of the new company culture. Mr. Xu, who had once been pressured to participate in false reporting, now led the company's new transparency initiative. "We don't just share the good numbers," he explained to a group of new hires. "We share the real ones, and we work together to make them better." The company's success had caught the attention of the business world. Industry magazines wanted to write about their transformation. Other CEOs called for advice. But Mr. Chen's focus remained internal, on maintaining the trust he'd worked so hard to build. During the annual company gathering, now held in a park rather than a formal venue, Mr. Chen watched his employees and their families enjoying themselves. Children played on the grass, colleagues shared food and stories, and the old barriers between departments had completely disappeared. "You really changed things," Dr. Li said, joining him on a park bench. "But not in the way we expected." Mr. Chen nodded, watching as a group of employees set up an impromptu volleyball game, mixing senior managers and junior staff on both teams. "The real change," he replied, "wasn't in the policies or the procedures. It was in how we saw each other as people." The lessons from his time as Mr. Wong had become part of the company's DNA. Every new policy was viewed through the lens of its impact on real people. Every decision was made with input from those it would affect most directly. As the sun set on the company picnic, Mr. Chen stood to make a short speech. But before he could begin, a young employee raised her hand. "Actually, sir," she said with a smile, "we'd like to share our thoughts first." And that, perhaps, was the biggest change of all, a CEO who didn't need to speak first, who had learned to listen before leading. The company hadn't just transformed its policies, it had transformed its soul. The story of the CEO who became invisible to see his company clearly had become legend. But the real story wasn't about deception or disguise. It was about breaking down walls, building genuine connections, and creating a workplace where every voice mattered. As Mr. Chen looked out at his company family, he remembered the words of wisdom from his parents' small grocery store. Success isn't about being at the top of the mountain. It's about helping others climb with you.